I had planned every detail for my 40th birthday. Not because I believed they would come, no, I had learned better then to expect that much. But still, hope is a stubborn little thing. Like a child pressing its face to the window, watching for a car that never turns the corner. The living room was glowing with the soft light of antique sconces. The table was dressed in navy and gold, echoing the colors of the invitation I'd mailed a month before. I'd baked my own cake, chocolate, layered with cherry preserves and dark ganache, and placed it like a crown jewel in the center of the table. Balloons nodded politely in the corners, and champagne bottles stood at attention in a crystal bucket. I wore the dress I'd saved for, a deep plum that matched the lipstick I rarely indulged in. I even bought myself roses, because I couldn't bear the look of an empty vase. And then I waited. 1 hour. Then 2. By the time the clock hands folded into midnight, even the candles seemed embarrassed to still be burning. Not a single soul came. Not my sister who lives 20 minutes away. Not my nephew whose tuition I helped pay last year. And certainly not my mother. She hadn't RSVP'd, but her silence has always been loud. I sat in that glowing room with a paper crown on my head, the only guest at my own celebration. And when the tears came, they were quiet and almost courteous, like they, too, had grown used to being uninvited. A month later, I received her message. It arrived in the form of a birthday card, oddly enough, one of those pastel numbers with flowers and looping cursive. Inside, her handwriting was sharp and urgent. It's our 45th anniversary. You owe me $5,000 and a car. No explanation. No greeting. Just a command masquerading as entitlement. You see, my mother has always believed that children are debts to be collected, not gifts to be cherished. She and my father had built a shrine to their sacrifices, and each year I was expected to kneel and offer more tribute. But this time, something inside me broke. Not like glass, not with a sound. More like a thread snapping after years of silent tension. I wrote a check for $10 and included a note in my own handwriting. That's all you deserve. I folded it with the same care she never showed me and mailed it without ceremony. 2 weeks later, I awoke to the sound of a key turning in my front door. Only it didn't work. I had changed the locks just after the birthday. That never was an act that felt both symbolic and necessary. The old key lay in the drawer now, its teeth dull with disuse. Through the peephole I saw them. My parents. Both gray and fuming, like thunderclouds that had wandered too far from the sky. They didn't knock. They tried the key again, jiggled the handle, then resorted to calling my name as if this were a childhood game of hide-and-seek. But I didn't answer. I watched them from the other side of the door, heart quiet and still. For once, I felt no panic. Just a strange, serene detachment, like I was watching a scene in a play I no longer cared to perform in. Eventually, they left. Not with regret. Not with apology. Just frustration, pure and undiluted. And as I turned away from the door, I smiled, not from cruelty, but from clarity. The locks were changed, not just on the door. On me, after they left, I walked through my house slowly, room by room, as if reacquainting myself with a place I had finally claimed. The air still held the scent of lavender and old wood, and the morning light spilled over the floor like forgiveness. I stopped at the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines, each novel, memoir, and poetry collection a kind of sanctuary I had built over the years. They were the voices that had comforted me when my own family's silence screamed too loud. My mother used to call me dramatic whenever I cried as a child. She'd say I had a flair for scenes, like emotion was something to be punished, not understood. I learned early that tears earned me nothing but contempt, and so I learned to cry alone, quietly, into pillows or under running water. I mastered invisibility before I could spell it. And yet, when they tried to force their way back into my life, physically this time, I was no longer that trembling girl hoping for love in whatever scraps they were willing to toss. I had become something else. Not cold. Not cruel. Just clear. That afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table and opened an old ledger. I'd kept it for years, not for budgeting, but as a record of what I had given. Not in dollars, though there were plenty of those, but in hours, in presence, in emotional currency. There was the entry marked 2006, Sienna's tuition fund, $3,200. My niece. Her parents had forgotten to plan ahead, and I'd wired the money without hesitation. She sent a thank you text. My sister never acknowledged it. 2010, Dad's surgery hotel stay, $850. I flew out, booked a nearby hotel, and stayed for a week, cooking and cleaning while he recovered. He never mentioned it again. 2015, Mom's retirement party, $2,300. I rented the hall, organized the catering, designed the invites. She told people my sister planned it. And yet, they sent a card demanding $5,000 and a car. As if love could be invoiced. As if I hadn't already paid. What I realized, writing those entries out again, was that I had mistaken love for obligation. I had given and given and given, thinking that one day, they'd see me. That recognition was a fair trade for sacrifice. But love, real love, is never transactional. It doesn't tally debts or issue ultimatums. So I closed the ledger, slipped it into a drawer, and made a new vow not to forget the past, but to stop bleeding for it. That evening, I made a cup of tea and stepped outside. The sky was bruised purple with twilight, the kind of quiet that feels earned. A breeze swept through the trees, rustling leaves like whispers. I stood there, barefoot on my porch, watching the world spin gently onward, and felt, for the first time in years, completely untethered from their judgment. They could no longer enter my house. And more importantly, they could no longer enter my peace. The next few days passed in a hush, like the calm that settles over a town after a storm has torn through. Nothing broken, exactly, but things had shifted, tilted. And in that shift, I began to see with new eyes. I stopped answering calls from unfamiliar numbers. I let voicemails pile up, little digital ghosts collecting dust. One of them was from my sister, her voice tight with forced civility. We heard about the incident. You didn't have to change the locks, Liv. Mom was just upset. She didn't mean anything by it. Maybe you're taking things a bit too personally? Too personally? I laughed when I heard it. A dry, mirthless sound that felt like it had been waiting years to come out. If I had taken anything personally, it was because I was made to carry their projections like hand-me-down coats, ill-fitting, but expected to wear them with grace. I hadn't spoken to my sister in months before that message. Not since the Christmas dinner where she referred to me as the one who never settled down, and Mom clinked her wine glass like it was a punchline. They never asked why I didn't marry. Why I didn't have children. Why I lived alone in a house I'd paid for in full by the age of 39. The truth? I had loved once. Fiercely. But he wasn't right. Not wrong in the cruel way, just wrong in the quiet ways. He wanted a version of me I didn't want to live in. Softer, smaller, less ambitious. When I chose myself over that vision, my family didn't ask questions. They offered condolences, not congratulations. As if independence was a form of grief. But I had built something here. A life. A sanctuary. And that was no small feat. One morning, I found myself opening the cedar chest in my bedroom, the one I rarely touched. Inside were photos, letters, old keepsakes. I hadn't looked at them in years. There was a photograph of me at 15, standing on the edge of a school stage, holding a trophy almost as tall as my torso. Debate team, state champion. I'd begged them to come. They never did. Next to it, a yellowed birthday card from my grandmother, the only person who had ever treated me like I was more than useful. To my dearest Olivia, it read in looping script. One day, they'll realize the diamond they left in the dark. Until then, keep shining for yourself. I wept. Not from pain. From release. Because in that moment, I understood that I didn't just survive them, I outgrew them. They clung to a version of me that no longer existed. The compliant daughter. The silent sibling. The reliable scapegoat. But that woman was gone. And the one who remained? She was no longer answering to ghosts. The hardest part, they never tell you, isn't the moment of breaking ties. It's the quiet that comes after. No text messages to decipher, no backhanded compliments to swallow. Just silence. At first, it felt like an empty auditorium after the play has ended. Echoes, dust, and an eerie stillness where applause should have been. But then, like eyes adjusting to the dark, I started to see it for what it was. Peace. Real, sacred, earned peace. And with that peace came a new power. The ability to say no. No, I wouldn't lend money to my cousin Brian to get back on his feet again. Not after he blew my last check on a trip to Vegas and ghosted me until he needed more. No, I wouldn't attend Aunt Ruth's family healing dinner just so I could be cornered into apologies I didn't owe. No, I wouldn't explain my decisions to people who had never bothered to understand them in the first place. The more I said no, the lighter I became. Like I was shedding the weight of a lifetime's worth of expectations, one refusal at a time. It's strange how people react when you stop performing the role they cast you in. Suddenly, you're difficult, unreasonable, cold. When I said no to a loan request, my brother texted, "Wow, guess success made you selfish." To which I replied simply, "No." It made me sovereign. He didn't respond. That was fine. Let him sit with it. They never called me selfish when I paid off their credit card debt. Or when I canceled my vacation to nurse mom after her hip surgery. Or when I co-signed the lease that my sister eventually defaulted on. But now, a boundary? A refusal? Suddenly, I was the villain in a story I'd never agreed to be part of. Let them rewrite their narratives. I was writing my own now. One morning, while tending the garden I'd nearly forgotten I planted, I noticed the first bloom of my roses' soft blush petals opening like forgiveness. They were stubborn, those roses. The soil here was rocky, the sun intermittent. But they bloomed anyway. And so, I thought, would I? Not for them. Not in spite of them. But for the girl who once believed she had to be everything for everyone to be worthy of love. She deserved a new chapter. I've always believed houses remember things. They hold the echoes of slammed doors, whispered dreams, footsteps pacing in the dark. My house, small, sunlit, with windows that drink in the morning, had become a kind of witness to my unfolding. The day I changed the locks wasn't just about security. It was a declaration. A line drawn, not in sand, but in steel. I remember standing there with the locksmith, a young man with kind eyes and tattooed knuckles. He didn't ask why I was doing it, but as he handed me the new keys, he said, "Whatever it is, you're safer now." He had no idea how right he was. Every time I turned that new key in the door, I felt something click inside me too. A reclamation. A quiet rebellion against every time I'd been told, "You're being dramatic," or "You're too sensitive," or worse, "You owe us." I owed them nothing. Not my time. Not my tears. Not my labor. And certainly not access to the place I had built, brick by metaphorical brick, in spite of them. My front porch became my sanctuary. In the early evenings, I'd sit with a cup of ginger tea, wrapped in a quilt my grandmother made before arthritis stiffened her fingers. She was the only one who ever knocked gently, who brought things in her hands, peaches in summer, warm bread in winter, and left with nothing but gratitude. I miss her. Sometimes I wonder what she'd say if she saw me now. Alone, yes, but not lonely. Not anymore. She once told me, "Solitude, Olivia, is a kind of courage. You sit with yourself and discover you are enough company." She was right. One quiet night, I found myself writing again. Not for work. Not to prove anything. Just writing. A letter to the girl I used to be. Dear Olivia, I'm sorry they didn't show up for your birthday. I'm sorry they didn't know what they had when they had you. But I want you to know I see you. I see the way you light candles for yourself. The way you cry and clean and keep going. I see your quiet strength, your stubborn hope, your boundless heart. You are not a failure. You are not too much. You are not invisible. You are here. And that's enough. Love. Me. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer with my favorite pen. A ritual. A kind of healing. Because sometimes you don't get the apology you deserve. So you give it to yourself. They came back once more. It was a Tuesday, late morning. The sun had cast long, languid lines across the floorboards, and I was deep into baking, a habit I'd picked up again. There's something alchemical about it, the way simple things like flour and eggs transform into comfort. I had just placed a tray of lemon scones in the oven when the doorbell rang. It startled me, not because I wasn't expecting company, but because I never do. I peeked through the curtain. There they were. My mother, wrapped in a too-tight cardigan that did little to soften her sharpness. And my father, arms crossed, mouth set in that stern way that always meant we're not here to talk. We're here to remind you who you belong to. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stepped back and turned the oven timer up a little louder. They knocked again. Then came the voice, my mother's, through the door. Olivia, we need to talk. You can't ignore us forever. But I could. I had, in fact, grown rather adept at it. I sat on the arm of the couch and listened, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to remember. To hear their words without reacting. To study them like old wounds under a microscope. My father chimed in next. You're being unreasonable. We're still your parents. You don't treat family this way. And that's when I felt the smallest smile tug at my lips. Because for the first time, I saw it clearly, how they clung to titles without earning the meaning behind them. Parents. Family. Words they wielded like weapons, forgetting they're supposed to be shelters. They left after 10 minutes, defeated not by shouting or confrontation, but by silence. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I simply didn't open it. And that, I've come to learn, is its own kind of power. After they left, I opened all the windows and let the air move freely through the house. Let it push out whatever lingering ghosts they tried to bring back in. Let the scent of lemon and sugar reclaim the air. I took the scones out of the oven and poured myself a cup of tea. I sat alone at the table, and it felt full. Because sometimes, peace doesn't look like a resolution. It looks like knowing you don't owe anyone your suffering to prove you're loved. It took weeks before I could look at the photos from that night, my 40th birthday, the one no one showed up for. They weren't many. Just a few snapshots I'd taken to remember the evening I'd hoped would mean something. A picture of the cake, glistening under soft candlelight. One of the gift bags lined up like soldiers awaiting guests who never came. A selfie, smiling, hopeful, before the reality of the empty room settled in. I studied that face. My own. So open. So eager. And I wanted to reach into the frame, to hold that woman and whisper, you are worth celebrating, even if no one else shows up. So I threw another party. Not for anyone else. Just for me. It wasn't on my birthday or any special occasion. It was on a random Thursday because healing doesn't wait for a date. I pulled out the good dishes. Wore the dress I didn't get to that night. Lit the candles. Played the music that used to make me feel alive. And I danced. Alone. In my kitchen, in my living room, through the hallway like a ghost reclaiming her story. I danced until my legs ached and my cheeks hurt from smiling. It wasn't sad. It was sacred. That night, I made a toast to no one, and to everyone I had ever been. To the girl who begged to be seen. To the woman who thought love had to be earned. To the heart that broke and kept beating. And then, I raised my glass. To me. The next morning, I woke to find an envelope slipped under my door. No name. No return address. Inside was a check. $5,000. No note. Just those cold numbers staring up at me like an accusation. At first, I laughed. The audacity. The twisted attempt at control, at guilt wrapped in generosity. Then I picked up a pen and wrote one word across the check in bold, in red. Returned. I walked it to the post office myself. Mailed it back to their address. No envelope. No explanation. Just truth. They would never understand that no amount of money could mend what they broke, not because I couldn't be bought, but because I finally knew what I was worth. And it wasn't this. It was so much more. Somewhere in a closet, tucked behind shoeboxes and tangled scarves, sat the binder I once used to track every family obligation I fulfilled. Receipts, emails, itineraries, proof that I had been there, that I had given and given well. For years, it had felt like armor. Like if I just documented enough, someone, anyone, might say, "We see you." Thank you. They never did. So I took that binder, heavy with unpaid gratitude, and I burned it. In a fire pit I hadn't lit in years, under a sky pocked with stars, I tore each page free and fed it to the flames. The air filled with the scent of old ink and scorched paper. It felt divine. This wasn't rage. This was release. A ritual to lay down the burden of proving my worth. As the last embers flickered, I realized something astonishing. Without that ledger, I didn't feel empty. I felt free. No more tallies. No more emotional bookkeeping. No more trying to earn love from people who only ever offered it in conditions and installments. The next day, I began a new notebook. But this one was different. I titled it, "The Ledger of Enough." Its pages weren't for obligations. They were for joy. On the first page, I wrote, "Woke up without anxiety today. Had tea in silence. Laughed during a podcast. Felt proud for returning the check. Remembered I don't need their approval to feel whole." Each line, a triumph. Each entry, a stitch in the tapestry of the life I was reclaiming. Because if I'd learned anything, it was this: being seen by others is a gift. But seeing yourself clearly, tenderly, truthfully is a revolution. And mine had just begun. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Not from them, no. This one bore no bitter demand, no veiled accusation. It was soft pink, handwritten, almost trembling. From my cousin Nina. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since the last family gathering where she sat at the edge of the room, quiet as snowfall, while our relatives laughed too loud at jokes meant to sting me. Inside the envelope was a note. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry. I should have said something then, and I don't know if it matters now, but I always admired you. You did what I couldn't. You walked away." I read that line 3 times, my throat tight with something unfamiliar. Was it validation? Grief? Relief? I didn't know, but I held the letter to my chest like an ember. Maybe that's how healing works, not in grand apologies or perfect closure, but in these small, human offerings. A kind word, a letter, a quiet echo from someone who saw what you endured and found courage in your defiance. I wrote back, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. "Thank you, Nina, for seeing me, for writing. That matters more than you know. I hope you find your door. And when you do, change the lock. Light a candle. Dance. You deserve peace, too." A week later, she replied. She had left her parents' house. Found a small apartment 2 towns over. She didn't know what came next, but she wrote, "For the first time, the silence feels like mine." I cried then. Not out of sorrow, but because it meant something, my story, my stand, my locked door, it mattered. Not just for me, but for someone else caught in a similar maze. We are not as alone as we think. There are others out there, watching, hoping, learning how to say no by watching someone else finally say it first. When I was younger, silence was a survival tool. I learned that staying quiet kept the peace, at least on the surface. Say nothing and maybe Dad wouldn't sigh so loudly. Don't protest, and maybe Mom would smile at me during dinner instead of reaching for the wine. But silence has a cost. It accumulates. Not in dollars, but in moments. Missed birthdays. Ignored pain. Achievements that were never clapped for. And eventually, that debt becomes too heavy to carry. After Nina's letter, I began to look more honestly at the weight I still bore. Not just from them, but from me. The ways I silenced my own truth, minimized my own pain to make space for their comfort. Like when they forgot my birthday at 25 and I told myself they were just busy. Or when my father told me, You should have been a boy. Boys don't cry over being alone, and I laughed, pretending it was a joke. Or when my mother said, "You'd have a family by now if you weren't so independent," and I thanked her, like it was a compliment. Each time I swallowed those words, a piece of me went quiet. So now I speak. Not to them. To myself. I speak aloud when I'm home alone, telling the mirror, "You deserved better." I read poetry that feels like exhale. I sing in the kitchen, not because I'm good, but because it feels like freedom. And I write. Pages and pages. Not for an audience, but for the girl I used to be. She needs to hear what no one ever said. You were never the problem. You were never too much. You were never a burden. The cost of silence was high, but the value of truth? It's priceless. And it echoes beautifully through every room I now claim as mine. They left me nothing. Not in the legal sense, at least. No mention of my name in any trust or deed. No heirloom jewelry passed down. No letters of apology tucked into the folds of an old blanket. My sister got the car, my brother the vacation home, and I got a voicemail from my mother. "You know why, Olivia. You've always been so difficult." That message? I saved it. Not as a wound, but as a reminder. Because in some twisted way, she was right. I was difficult, at least for people who demanded compliance over authenticity. I refused to be small. I refused to contort myself into their image of a good daughter. I said no when I was meant to nod. I left when I was expected to stay. I spoke when silence was required. And if that made me difficult, then thank God I was. Still, even when you know it's right, being cut off feels like a kind of death. The funeral of expectation. The burial of an imagined reconciliation. So I mourned. Not them, but the version of me who once believed love had to be earned by sacrifice. Who would have emptied her own pockets to pay for someone else's praise? I lit a candle for her one night. Placed it on the mantel. Watched it flicker and soften. Then I blew it out. And I chose to begin again. You see, inheritance isn't just what's written in wills. It's also what we choose to carry forward. They left me no money, no property. But they taught me what I would never do to someone I love. And in that, I inherited a different kind of legacy. One forged in resistance. One rooted in truth. One that begins with a locked door and a woman standing behind it, no longer waiting to be chosen. If you wait long enough, people say, the apology will arrive. Wrapped in awkward phrasing. Folded into an invitation. Hidden beneath a passing, we were all going through things. But sometimes it never comes. And the longer I waited, the more I realized I wasn't actually waiting for them. I was waiting for me to stop needing it. There's a particular ache that comes from imagining the apology. You rehearse it. You picture their faces, softened by remorse. You even hear the words, "I'm sorry I didn't show up. I'm sorry I didn't see you." But the moment never comes. Because they don't know how to give what they never had themselves: accountability, vulnerability, grace. So I stopped waiting. And I started writing apologies I would never receive. One for every milestone they missed. I'm sorry we laughed when you cried. I'm sorry we made your strength into something cold. I'm sorry we mistook your boundaries for betrayal. I wrote them in the margins of my journals, on napkins, in the steam on my bathroom mirror. And slowly, a strange thing happened. The need loosened its grip. Not because the pain vanished, but because I no longer needed them to hold it. It was mine now, and I was learning how to carry it with dignity. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes, it's just choosing to live fully, even without the closure you were owed. And in that living, you become your own apology, your own peace, your own beginning point. 3 months after the incident, the doorbell, the demand, the check, I received an invitation. A wedding. My niece Sienna. She of the champagne flute Instagram reels and curated sorrow over family misunderstandings. The envelope was embossed, gold-trimmed, elegant in that performative way. Inside, the invitation was impersonal. Olivia Parker, you are cordially invited. No handwritten note. No acknowledgement of the silence between us, of the lock they once tried to break. But what truly caught my eye wasn't the invite itself. It was the location. My hotel. The Paragon. The crown jewel I built from blueprints and bankruptcy. They didn't know, of course. They'd booked through a planner, chosen it for the photos, for the prestige, for the shallow prestige they once claimed was beneath me. I held the invitation between my fingers, a strange blend of amusement and ache blooming in my chest. All those years they laughed at my little hospitality hobby. All those family dinners where I was the punchline. And now, unknowingly, they were celebrating under a roof I designed. Toasting love in a ballroom where I chose the marble. Where my name sat on every deed and behind every decision. Poetic, really. I made no scene. I simply called my staff, gave quiet instructions. The suite they'd reserved? Downgraded, subtly. Still lovely, but no view. The champagne toast? Replaced with a house vintage. The dom they'd requested was unavailable. And their guest of honor, me? I didn't attend. I went to the spa instead. Booked the private room. Had a massage, then a long, hot soak overlooking the skyline. I toasted myself with real champagne and whispered, "This is what reclaiming looks like." Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't confrontation. It's peace. It's letting them dance in your empire without ever knowing they walked into the temple of the daughter they dismissed. From the penthouse balcony of my hotel, the city unfurled beneath me like a tapestry woven from light and noise. Car horns below sang in chaotic harmony, while street lamps flickered like stars trapped in glass. Below, in the grand ballroom, the wedding unfolded. I could see their silhouettes, my family, polished and unaware. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through soundproofed windows. My mother's silver hair caught the chandelier's gleam like frost. They had no idea I was watching. I wasn't hiding. I simply didn't need to be seen anymore. There's power in anonymity when it's chosen. For years, I had tried to be visible in a family that only saw reflections of themselves in others. Tried to prove I was worthy, valuable, real, even if I didn't wear the titles they revered. And here they were, basking in the glow of a life they once mocked, never realizing whose name lay hidden in every cornerstone. But I wasn't angry. Not tonight. Tonight, I was grateful. Grateful that they had forced me to build my own table, my own roof, my own home, where respect wasn't a currency to be bargained with, but the ground floor of love. As the music below swelled into some familiar pop song, I leaned against the balcony railing and closed my eyes. Somewhere deep in the city, a woman cried because her parents didn't show up to her graduation. Somewhere else, a girl begged to be understood instead of corrected. And somewhere, a daughter turned the lock on a door she bought with her own courage. We are everywhere. Not bitter. Just free. The kind of freedom that comes with knowing, even if no one else shows up, you did. For yourself. And that is enough. The morning after the wedding, a letter was left at the front desk. Not addressed by name, but clearly intended for me. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting angular and defensive. From my mother. I opened it slowly, expecting the usual, veiled accusations, half-hearted reachings, the word ungrateful buried somewhere in the third paragraph. But instead, it said, "I don't know when you became so cold. Your father and I gave you everything. We thought you'd at least show up for family. You used to be so sweet." There it was. That subtle twist. The weaponization of memory. I used to be sweet. Sweet, like silence. Like compliance. Like surrender. Sweet before I learned boundaries taste like steel and sound like no. I folded the letter once neatly. Then again. Then again. Until it was a small, tight square I could tuck away. Not to reread, but to remember. Because even exit wounds leave scars. And even when we heal, there's still the ghost of ache. I walked through the lobby, nodding at staff, exchanging small smiles. The building buzzed with checkout energy, the scent of coffee and stale champagne lingering in the air. At the elevator, I saw them. My parents. My mother's lips were pursed in that familiar disappointment. My father avoided my eyes, fixated instead on the scrolling numbers above the elevator door. Neither spoke. Neither had to. They knew now. They had danced in my legacy, slept in my sheets, toasted in my halls. And still, they didn't say thank you. But I didn't need them to. That was the liberation. You see, I had once mistaken acknowledgement for love. Thought that to be seen by them was to be real. But I am real with or without their reflection. So I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the penthouse, and let the doors close slowly between us. It felt like the final chapter of a book I'd once memorized, now set aside. And somewhere in that quiet hum of rising steel, I smiled. Because the daughter they thought they'd lost? She never existed. The woman I am now? She's not waiting to be found. She's busy building. That evening, after the guests had long since checked out and the hotel returned to its quieter rhythm, I sat at my writing desk in the suite and took out fresh paper. Not hotel stationery, my own, embossed with my initials. A quiet luxury. A private rebellion. I began writing letters. Not to my parents. Not to my sister. To her. The woman I had become. Dear Olivia, I see you. I see how you filled every silence with compassion, every absence with presence. I see how you tried, God, you tried, to belong to a family that never left the door open without a price. You've stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even offer you a bandage. And in doing so, you've healed in ways they'll never understand. You are not broken. You are not bitter. You are simply done. I wrote until my fingers cramped and the lamp cast long shadows over the page. And with each letter, a little more grief left my body. Like smoke through an open window. There was a time I would have torn these pages up, afraid of how they might be read. But now, I tucked them into a box I labeled Truth and slid it into the drawer beside my bed. Someday I might burn them. Or I might read them aloud to someone else trying to walk away from their own storm. Because these words weren't confessions. They were maps. For every woman like me who stood in a room of people and felt invisible. For every daughter whose love was mistaken for obligation. For every soul who changed the locks and still worried, in the quiet, that it made them cruel. We are not cruel. We are courageous. And courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly refuses to open the door. In the days that followed, I began clearing out things I hadn't touched in years. Not because I was planning to move. This home was mine in a way no place had ever been, but because I no longer wanted to carry what wasn't sacred. Old coats from holidays where I smiled through gritted teeth. Trinkets from birthdays where their presence felt like performance. Even the framed family photo in the hallway, where I stood slightly to the side, edited in both pixels and memory. I wrapped it all in soft cloth and placed it gently into boxes. It wasn't bitterness that moved me. It was clarity. Because as I looked around the space I had claimed, I realized something profound. They had given me a gift. Not the kind they ever meant to give, not wrapped or ribboned, not asked for or acknowledged. But a gift, nonetheless. They taught me that I could survive disappointment. That I could endure absence. That I could build joy out of loneliness and peace out of silence. They taught me what love isn't, so I could recognize what it is when I finally found it. Not the kind of love that keeps score or demands obedience, but the kind that says, you don't have to earn this. You just have to be. And perhaps most importantly, they taught me that being estranged doesn't mean being broken. It can also mean being safe. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to return to the people who never learned how to hold your heart. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their table. Because I had built my own, and it was set with peace, served with honesty, and seated only with those who came hungry for truth. That is the life they unintentionally handed me. And I was finally ready to live it. After the boxes were sealed and the charity pickup scheduled, I sat on the floor of my living room and surrounded myself with the things I had chosen to keep. A teacup with a tiny crack near the rim, my grandmother's. She used to say imperfections held stories. That cup had heard mine more times than I could count. A scarf I bought at a flea market in Lisbon, the one I wore when I first dared to travel alone and realized solitude could be symphonic. A photo, not of family, but of me, mid-laugh, windblown, unscripted. Taken by a stranger who'd said, "You have joy in your face. Let me show you." I kept these. And my journals. The ones full of firsts. The first time I said no and didn't explain it. The first day I didn't check my phone for messages that wouldn't come. The first night I lit candles just for myself, without occasion. Each page a monument. Each item a sacred witness. Because we all carry things, memories, regrets, small tokens of survival. But the real liberation comes not from letting go of everything, but from choosing what deserves to come with you. And these things? They weren't relics of pain. They were proof of who I became in spite of it. That night, I placed the teacup on the windowsill, the scarf in a frame, and the photo beside my bed. Not as decor. As declarations. This is who I am now. This is what I've kept. And this, finally, is enough. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you hear your own name and it no longer sounds like a burden. For years, Olivia felt heavy. Like an obligation. Like something said with exasperation or scorn. Olivia, why can't you just? Olivia, don't be so sensitive. Olivia, we did our best. Let it go. But lately, I've been reclaiming it. Whispering it in the mirror like an incantation. Signing it at the bottom of love letters I write to myself. Saying it aloud in rooms where no one else is present, just to hear how it lands in the silence. Because names carry power. They hold history, expectation, identity. And I'm no longer interested in carrying the version of Olivia they handed me. I've rewritten her story. She's not the fragile one. She's the flame. She's the lock. She's the woman who dances alone, who writes her own endings, who stands still while others storm. And when I hear my name now, I hear its true meaning. Not a question. Not a command. But a declaration. A banner. A soft, fierce anthem that says, I am here. I have always been here. And I am no longer asking for space, I'm taking it. So tonight, under a blanket of stars, too proud to apologize for shining, I whispered my name again. Olivia. And for the first time, it echoed back with reverence. There are still moments, unexpected, quiet, where the old ache slips in like a draft under a closed window. An ad for Mother's Day brunch. A neighbor's porch echoing with laughter. A voicemail I almost didn't delete. It doesn't unravel me anymore. But it reminds me that healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Some days you circle back to the ache, not to stay, but to remember. To remember who you were before the boundary. Before the lock. Before you realized that not all family is a safe place to land. I walk through my home now with purpose, touching walls I once felt guilty for claiming. These rooms, they belong to me. Every coat of paint, every plant that leans toward the sun. They were all chosen with intention, not apology. And there is a room I keep locked. Not out of shame, but respect. It's the room with the memories I'm still learning to hold with gentleness. Photos I'm not ready to burn. Letters I once begged for. A dress I wore to my last family reunion, the one where I left early and no one followed. I don't go in often, but I don't fear it anymore either. Because I know what's behind that door. And I know that when I'm ready, I'll open it, not to reopen wounds, but to reclaim space. Until then, I honor the lock. Not as a denial of the past, but as a tribute to the future I'm building. One room, one decision, one refusal at a time. I once imagined sending them a letter. Not to beg. Not to explain. Just to declare. I'm not coming back. You won't find me at your anniversaries, your holidays, your rehearsed apologies that stop short of truth. I've stopped asking to be loved in the language you refuse to learn. But I never wrote it, not because I didn't mean it, because I no longer needed them to read it. There is a freedom in not needing your pain acknowledged to believe it was real. There is power in choosing not to make announcements, but changes. And the change had already happened. I no longer watched the door. I no longer rehearsed what I'd say if they finally said the right thing. I had stopped living in the waiting room of their maybe. I didn't send that letter because it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for the girl I used to be. The one who checked her phone every birthday, hoping. The one who rehearsed smiles for family photos that always cut her out. The one who shrank herself so they could be comfortable. To her, I say, you never had to earn their love. You were already worthy. They chose silence. You chose peace. And now, your life is an invitation you only extend to those who know how to enter gently. So no, I won't send that letter. I'll just keep living its truth. And that will be the loudest thing they never hear. Point one of the quietest revolutions in my life was learning to stop explaining myself. Not because I ran out of words, but because I realized who I was explaining things to, people who never listened, only waited to respond. People who didn't want understanding, only control. I used to narrate every decision. I can't make it because I'm overwhelmed. I said no because I need rest. I changed the locks because I needed safety. But explanations are wasted on those who believe your boundary is a betrayal. So I stopped. Now, when the messages come, when someone dares to ask, but why, in that tone of guilt masquerading as concern, I don't answer. Because I don't owe an essay to anyone about why I chose peace. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, it's sovereignty. And every time I resist the pull to justify my joy, my distance, my no, I reclaim another inch of ground beneath my own feet. Explanations may soothe guilt, but boundaries build homes. And I am done inviting people into mine who stomp when they walk. Not all family is blood. Some of them arrive slowly, coworkers who remember how you take your coffee. Neighbors who bring soup when you're sick without being asked. The barista who notices when your smile doesn't reach your eyes and offers extra foam anyway. Some of them arrive like lightning, quick, electric friendships forged in late-night honesty, when someone says you too, and you exhale for the first time in days. They don't ask you to shrink. They don't rewrite your story. They don't silence your grief or call your boundaries rude. They simply show up. And stay. When I threw a dinner last fall, it wasn't for family. It was for the people who had become my family. A teacher who encouraged my writing. A woman from my book club who never flinched at hard truths. A man I once cried beside on a park bench after he asked, "Are you okay?" and actually waited for the answer. They came with laughter, with stories, with hands that helped clean and hearts that asked for nothing in return. We sat around my table, and passed dishes like love notes. We shared silence without tension, joy without envy. And I looked around and realized, this is family. Not perfect. Not always permanent. But chosen. And that is the most sacred kind. There was a time I would have given anything for a seat at theirs. Their table, where judgment sat like centerpiece, where love was rationed like dessert, where I was always too much or not enough. I spent years pulling out chairs, setting places, trying to fit into a feast that always ended before I arrived. But now I have my own table. It's smaller, quieter, but every seat here is sacred. No one earns their place by pleasing me. No one loses it for needing space. Here, we pass honesty like bread. We pour wine for grief and toast to growth. There are no hidden menus. No shame side dishes. No forced small talk laced with landmines. At this table, you can show up as yourself and be fed. And the most important seat? It's the one I reserved for me. The girl who once stood at the edge of every room, hoping for permission. She now sits at the head. Not because she fought for it, but because she finally believed she belonged. And every time I light the candles and set a place, I whisper to her, you didn't need their invitation. You only needed your own.